Buenos días a todos. Vamos a dar inicio a nuestra conferencia magistral del día de hoy. El día de hoy tenemos a John Cook, que viene del Global Change Institute de la Universidad de Queensland en Australia. John viene a hablarnos, a explicarnos los mecanismos que utilizan aquellas personas que se llaman escépticos o que también niegan el cambio climático, y sobre todo su gran punto es cómo crear estrategias para tratar con estas personas, cómo se puede uno enfrentar con aquellos que niegan el cambio climático a través de la comunicación científica. John, it is a great pleasure to have you here. We feel honored that you're here with us, so I give you the microphone.
Thanks, Luis. You could have said anything about me then, and I'd be none the wiser. Thanks very much to UNAM and for Luis for inviting me. What I'd like to talk about today is how should scientists respond to misinformation and to science denial? What is an evidence-based approach to a scientific response to misinformation? And if we could go to the next slide, please. The first question I'd like to address is, why do we need to respond to misinformation and to science denial? Can't we just ignore it? Can't we just concentrate on communicating the science? Because over the last few decades, the scientific evidence for climate change has been building and accumulating. The evidence that humans are causing global warming has gotten stronger. This slide shows the last three reports from the Ipcc from 2001 to 2013. And what we've seen is in each report, the Ipcc make an attribution statement describing how much humans are contributing to global warming. And what we see is each attribution statement in subsequent reports has expressed a greater confidence that humans are causing global warming. So we see in 2001 there was 66% confidence that humans were causing most of global warming since 1950. And then moving forward to the latest report, it's now greater than 95% confident that humans are causing most of global warming. So the scientific consensus has been getting stronger over time. Now, if we look at the next slide, that strengthening consensus is also reflected in peer-reviewed papers. This graph shows the results of an analysis that I collaborated with a range of other researchers. And we looked at 21 years worth of peer-reviewed climate papers. We went through all these tens of thousands of papers and identified the papers that stated the position on whether humans were causing global warming or not. Now, among those papers that stated the position, we found that overall, on average over that 21-year period, there was 97.1% agreement that humans were causing global warming. Now, if you go to the early part of the time period, in the early 1990s, even then we see strong agreement that humans are causing global warming. But even from that high level of agreement, the consensus continued to strengthen over time. So we have strong scientific agreement, and that agreement is getting stronger over time. Now, at the same time that the scientific consensus has been strengthening, there's also been organisations and groups that oppose climate action, that oppose mitigation policies. And if we go to the next slide, it's quite illuminating to look at what the groups who oppose climate action, what are the types of arguments they use against climate action. Now, this analysis, it hasn't been published yet, but the authors gave me permission to show their results. What they did was they looked at tens of thousands of articles and reports by conservative think tanks. Conservative think tanks are one of the most common or the most prolific sources of arguments against climate action. And they conducted content analysis to work out the types of arguments that they were using against climate action. And then they divided these arguments into either arguments against climate science or arguments against different types of climate solutions or policy. Now, you would think that as the consensus got stronger, as the evidence built up over time, that the public debate about climate change should move from the science, is climate change happening, to policy, what are the best solutions to mitigate against climate change. Now their analysis showed that the opposite is actually happening. As the scientific evidence has gotten stronger, conservative think tanks have actually doubled down on attacking the science. So we see that in the last half decade, the proportion of arguments attacking the science have actually increased relative to the amount of arguments criticising climate policies. So conservative think tanks are focusing a lot of their energies, and even increasingly so, against climate science. Now, if we look at the next slide, it's also instructive to look at what is the nature of these attacks on climate science. What are the type of arguments they use? Now, another analysis by Sean Alsasser and Riley Dunlap looked at 4 years' worth of conservative opinion pieces in newspapers. And they basically built a whole taxonomy of all the different arguments that were used, whether they were policy arguments or science arguments. And this graph shows the 4 most common arguments. And the most common argument by far was that there is no scientific consensus that humans are causing global warming. So the most common argument against climate action by conservative writers was attacking or manufacturing doubt about the scientific consensus. Now, why do they do that? If we look at the next slide, we see that there's a growing body of psychological research in how people think about climate change, and in particular how they think about scientific consensus. And what this research has found is that public perception of scientific consensus, what people think about what the scientific experts think, is a key gateway belief. What they think about consensus has flow-on effects to a whole range of other different climate beliefs. So if people think that climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming, then they're also more likely to think that climate change is happening, that humans are causing it, that climate change is dangerous. And most importantly, when people understand that the scientists agree, they're more likely to support climate policy. So perceived consensus as a gateway belief, it's key to public support for climate policy. And this means also, conversely, that when the public don't think that the scientists agree, they're less likely to support climate policy. So if we look at the next slide, what is the state of public perception of consensus? Now, I've been measuring public perception of consensus over the last few years. When I surveyed a representative sample of Americans, and I asked them how many climate scientists, or what percentage of climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming, the average answer was 55%. So the general public think there's a 50-50 debate amongst the scientific community, which is not that surprising when you think that the media often portray climate change as a climate scientist arguing with a dissenting scientist. And so they see this 50-50 debate on TV, and that informs people's views about the state of scientific understanding. So we have this big gap between public perception and the actual 97% reality. And as we've just seen in the previous slide about gateway beliefs, this is a big problem, because when you have this consensus gap, you have a significant roadblock to public support for climate policy. Now, if we go to the next slide, this shows other research results not quite published, but again, I got permission from the author to show these results because they really cut to the heart of what I'm talking about. It echoes my research, but it adds some extra nuances, which are pretty cool. Now, what this research did, headed by Sander van der Linden at Yale University, is he ran an experiment where he measured participants' perception of perceived consensus. Then he showed them different types of information, and then he measured their perceived consensus again, just to measure what effect certain different types of information have on perceived consensus. So the first column here looks at what happened when he showed people information about the 97% consensus. He showed them a little pie chart saying 97% of climate scientists agree on climate change. And what he found was people's perceived consensus increased by about 20% and had a big effect. So that's quite a powerful message for climate communicators. For the second column, he also tested what happened when he presented misinformation about the consensus. And this is one of the really interesting parts of his experiment. As a pilot leading into this study, he took 6 different climate myths and tested them all, and he found that the most powerful myth in reducing people's beliefs was attacks on consensus. Again, showing just what a psychological lever perceived consensus is. So for this experiment, he used the misinformation that cast out on the consensus. I'll actually give you an example of it later on in this talk. And what he found was the misinformation reduced perceived consensus by around 10%. So again, it had a significant effect in lowering people's climate beliefs. Now the third column here is actually, it's one of those curious cases in a scientific experiment where you get no result. But it's actually possibly the most interesting result in this whole experiment, because what he did was for one group in his experiment, he showed them the consensus information about the 97% consensus, and then he showed them the misinformation. And what he found was there was no change in belief amongst this group. So the consensus information and the misinformation basically cancelled each other out. And there's big consequences for this result for science communicators and scientists, because what it means is we might spend all this time developing or communicating our science, or even working hard on communicating the science as well as possible, but all that work can be undone by misinformation. So as scientists, we can't discount the fact that misinformation is out there and it interferes with the scientific good information that we're putting out there. And it took me a long time to answer the question I posed at the start of this talk, but the question is, can't we just ignore denial? Why do we need to respond to it? The third column in this graph is the reason why, because misinformation interferes with good information. And in this case, what it does is it maintains the consensus gap. Misinformation is the reason why there's been a persistent consensus gap for several decades. So what do we do about that? How do we deal if our good information is being cancelled out by misinformation? What's the solution? And the fourth column, I think, points to an answer. What they did here was they presented the 97% consensus, and then they presented some inoculation information, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. And then they presented the misinformation. And what they found was the inoculation essentially neutralised the misinformation, and there was a positive change in belief. So I probably should explain what I mean by inoculation. And if we go to the next slide, this was a branch of psychological research which I came upon almost by accident. And at the same time that I was looking into this, Sander van der Linden at Yale University was also, unbeknownst to me, conducting almost the same experiments that I was conducting. Scientists hate it when that happens. But what inoculation theory does is it borrows the metaphor of vaccines or inoculation, but applies it to knowledge. Now, what the theory suggests is there's 2 types of information that we can communicate. And using the metaphor of vaccines, there's either vitamins or flu shots. Now, a vitamin, in the case of, normally when we take vitamins, putting aside the fact that the benefits of vitamins are a bit overblown, but it's just a metaphor at this point. When we take vitamins, they make you healthier and stronger, right? Now, in the case of inoculation theory, vitamins are scientific information explaining the science. And when we explain the science to people, they get a stronger, healthier understanding of the science. Now, that's a good thing. It's an essential thing. We have to do that. But vitamins don't necessarily give us immunity when we encounter a virus. And in the same way, explaining the science to people doesn't necessarily give them the tools to make sense of misinformation when it comes along. They might understand the facts and the science, but then when a myth comes along, they might not have any way of reconciling them. So for example, you might explain the greenhouse effect to people, and they might get it. They might get that sunlight comes in and infrared comes out and the greenhouse gases trap it. But then someone comes along and says, but greenhouse gases are only a trace gas. They're only 0.04% of the atmosphere. How can that possibly make a difference? And suddenly the person has no way of reconciling the facts with the myth. And so that's why there's a second type of information that we need to communicate. And the metaphor that we use is flu shots. But what we're essentially doing is we're explaining the techniques of misinformation. We're explaining the arguments and the techniques used to distort the science. Because when people have the facts, but then they also understand the techniques used to distort the facts, then when a myth comes along, they're able to reconcile the two. And the misinformation no longer interferes with the science. And so this is the heart of inoculation theory. There's been studies conducted since the 1960s where they test either just giving people the facts or giving them the facts plus inoculation as well. And they found that inoculation gave people immunity or resistance to the misinformation. So the facts alone didn't help give them immunity. But when they were inoculated as well, then the misinformation had no influence on them. Now, I was independently playing around with this theory myself. And if we go to the next slide, I was running an experiment where I was using this misinformation. Now, this happened to be the same misinformation that the Yale University was using as well. And this was text that I took verbatim from a website called the Global Warming Petition Project. What they've done is they have a list of 31,000 people who have qualifications of a science degree or higher. And these 31,000 people have signed this statement saying that humans human activity is not disrupting our climate. So 31,000 scientists dissenting from the consensus position. Now, what I did was I tested what would happen if I presented this information to participants in an experiment. And if we look at the next slide, we see the results. Now, overall, the results were almost the same as Yale University's. But what I'm doing here in this graph is showing the change in belief, or the change in perceived consensus, and the horizontal axis here is political ideology. So as you move towards the right, the participants were more conservative. And so what this results show is that people, as you got more conservative, their change in perceived consensus was greater or went down lower. In other words, climate misinformation has a bigger effect as you become more conservative. So whereas someone at the liberal end of the political scale, the climate misinformation had pretty much no effect on them. And overall, there was about a 10% decrease in perceived consensus. Now, the next thing I did was, if we can go to the next slide, I also, for another group of participants, before I showed them the misinformation, I gave them an inoculation. And one way that my experiment differed from the Yale University study is I didn't mention the consensus at all. I just wanted to test the effect of inoculation. And so what I did was I had some text explaining the technique of fake experts or non-experts using spokespeople who had the appearance of expertise but didn't actually have any relevant expertise in the particular area. And then I used as an example the same technique being used by the tobacco industry in the 1970s to cast doubt on the scientific consensus that smoking caused cancer. And they would use tens of thousands of doctors who were smart-looking, professionals in white coats that, seem to convey expertise, but didn't actually do any scientific research into the health impacts of smoking and cancer. But to the general public, they didn't see that distinction. These were just experts saying that smoking was good, not bad for your health. And so if we go to the next slide, we see the result of this inoculation. Now the blue line shows the change in perceived consensus for the people who were inoculated before seeing the misinformation. And overall, there's no effect. The misinformation was completely neutralised. And even for people at the conservative end, there was a slight backfire effect or a slight increase in belief, although it was not statistically significant. But the take home is that inoculation completely neutralised the influence of the misinformation. And combining this results with Yale University, it tells us that when you couple science, communicating science, with also inoculation messages that communicate how that science can be distorted, then you not only communicate the science and increase people's scientific understanding, you also arm them with the resistance against misinformation. Now, if we go to the next slide, a big question is how do we practically apply this? And I think one of the most powerful ways that we can apply this research findings is in the classroom. Now, and it turns out that educators have been doing this for several decades, but it goes under a lot of different names. There's agnotology-based learning, or misconception-based learning, or refutational teaching. And a range of different studies have found that when you teach students by directly addressing misconceptions, it actually has a more powerful effect in reducing misconceptions in the students than if you just straight teach them the science. So this is essentially the same results as what we found. I know they found it several decades before we did. I wish I'd known before I started my studies, but that's okay. And so this result here, this is from the University of Sydney, Derek Muir, and he found that misconception-based learning or teaching by directly addressing misconceptions was significantly more effective and up to twice the effect in learning gains compared to just standard lessons. Now, if we go to the next slide, here is one way that we've applied this teaching technique, this misconception-based learning in a practical way. Sorry, no, wrong slide. So before I get to that, I think it's important. How am I going for time, Luis? How are we going?
You're good. We have 30 minutes.
Oh, right, sweet. Okay, I can go through all of it in detail then. All right, so this slide here is really summarises all the psychological research, or a lot of it, into misconceptions, misinformation, and debunking. I've tried to simplify it, but there's a lot in here, because this looks at what are the most effective ways to structure a debunking when you're responding to a myth. And it's actually almost the opposite to the customary way that debunkings are structured. Usually you'll have the myth in a big headline at the top, and you'll see this in flyers and in newspaper articles. There's a headline myth, it describes a myth, and then it talks about the science. The psychology tells us that you actually need to do it in completely the opposite way. You need to start by emphasising the facts. Start by identifying what is the key fact that you want to communicate to people, and lead with that, with the headline in the opening text. And it's also not enough just to communicate the facts. You need to make your facts as compelling and as memorable and as sticky as possible. And I'll get into what I mean by that in a moment. It's a great book, actually it'll be on the next slide, called Made to Stick. And they, if we go back, sorry, I was getting ahead of myself. But they have a great rule, which I call the golden rule of debunking, which is fight sticky myths with stickier facts. Not only do we have to communicate our science well, we have to communicate it better than the myths. We have to make our science as simple and as compelling as possible. So that's a big challenge. Like, it's really difficult to take complicated science and distill it into a simple, powerful message. But that's a challenge that scientists and science communicators have. Now, secondly, you do need to directly mention the myth. The only problem is the more familiar people become with any type of information, the more likely they are to think that it's true. That means that if we go around mentioning myths, people are becoming more familiar with the myths, which means that they're more likely to think that it's true. And this research has led to something called the familiarity backfire effect. If we make people too familiar with a myth when we debunk it, we can actually reinforce the myth. It was this research that first got me interested in psychology. As someone with a physical science background, I was debunking myths about climate science. And then a psychologist emailed me this paper saying, do you realise that you're actually doing this in a way that can reinforce the myth? And realising that there was this, potentially I was making matters worse. That was a kind of a life-changing moment when I realised I better find out as much as possible about the psychology of debunking. But you do have to mention the myth. So the one thing you can do to reduce the risk of a familiarity backfire effect is give people an explicit warning that you're about to mention the myth before you do. And what that does is it puts people cognitively on guard. It's kind of a Danger Will Robinson myth approaching, and people know like they're less likely to be influenced. They're on guard just before you mention it. And then lastly, you need to explain the technique or the fallacy in that myth. How does that myth distort the science? And I have a framework that I find really useful for explaining the different techniques of science that are, and I'll come to that in more detail in a moment. But if we go to the next slide, let me go back to this golden rule of debunking. Fight sticky myths with stickier facts. Now, how do you make your science sticky? What are the practical ways to do this? And I would recommend this book to anyone who's involved in science communication or any form of communication. What this book, Made to Stick, does is it looks at a whole range of different examples of sticky messages, whether they're folk stories or sayings or ad campaigns, just things that grabbed the public's attention and achieved public consciousness. And they looked at all these different examples across different mediums, and they found that they all shared some of the following 6 characteristics. And practicing what they preach, they use the acronym SUCCESS to summarize these 6 characteristics of sticky messages. They all were simple. Simple messages are easier to remember than complicated messages, and easier to understand. When they're unexpected, when you take people by surprise, people remember it better. And also, there's work by Mike Ranney at the University at Berkeley in California, and he found that when he surprised people with counterintuitive numbers about climate change, numbers that people didn't realise, like the 97% consensus, there was a greater change in belief because I guess there was further for their belief to go. But it just showed that taking people by surprise is a powerful thing. And so that means that when you're trying to communicate counterintuitive science, that can actually be a positive thing. If you emphasise the counterintuitiveness, emphasise, hey, this is really weird stuff, then that gets people's attention. Now, science, sticky messages need to be credible, and I think that that's one thing where scientists do have an advantage, because we're the scientific experts, we're publishing peer-reviewed research, and we're drawing upon that as our source, and that's the most credible source of information available. Science also needs to be concrete, and this is a big challenge for scientists, because science, especially climate change, is often abstract. It's statistical. So we have to find ways to take these statistical concepts and boil them down into a concrete image or a concrete metaphor. In fact, metaphors, I find, are one of the most powerful ways of taking abstract concepts and turning them into a concrete concept that people can make sense of. The beauty of metaphors is we're also piggybacking on concepts that people already have in their heads, so we don't have to build it from scratch. We can take existing concepts and explain our science using those. Now, sticky ideas are often emotional. Again, this is a challenge, but emotional messages are both, they both get people's attention more, they're more memorable, and they're shared more often. Probably emotional messages and pictures of kittens, probably the two of the things that get shared most on the internet. In fact, but as scientists, that's a challenge because we're trained to take the emotion out of our research. So how do we deal with that? I think one way is to, I think it's quite powerful for scientists to admit that we are humans and we are affected by even our own research. Right? That communicating what effect it has on us as people, I think that's a powerful way that we can both communicate the science but also communicate the emotional impact of that scientific findings. And lastly, the way people remember things is through stories. Stories are the most easy way to remember facts. You take a whole bunch of random facts and string it into a story. It's significantly easier to remember. So if you can communicate your science in the form of a compelling narrative, then you go a long way to making it more sticky and easier to remember. So that's the 6 characteristics of sticky messages. So on the next slide, I'd like to show you the framework for explaining the techniques of denial. This is really the backbone of how you inoculate people against misinformation. Now, there's a paper by Pascal Diethelm and Martin McKee that it's similar to the Made the Stick, but what they do is they looked at different movements that deny a scientific consensus, whether it's a consensus on climate change or evolution or the consensus that smoking causes cancer. And what they found was all these different movements shared the same 5 techniques. They all use fake experts, which I mentioned earlier. They use logical fallacies. There's a whole family of logical fallacies, and the second row in this figure shows just a selection of them. They demand impossible expectations of the science. The tobacco industry really perfected this strategy in the 1970s. They would demand ever higher levels of proof that smoking causes cancer as a way of delaying any regulation against the tobacco industry. And we see the same thing with climate science, demanding ever higher levels of proof or higher levels of quality from our climate models, demanding that they prove things that climate models just aren't built to do. The cherry picking is probably the most common technique of science denial, because when all the full body of evidence all points to a consistent picture, the only way you can get around that is by just grabbing little pieces of evidence from that full body, just little pieces of data that paint the picture that you want, rather than the picture that the full body tells us. And lastly, when you believe something and then the whole global community of scientists believe something else, how do you explain that? Ultimately, the only way is through conspiracy theories. Like either that whole global community of scientists all accidentally made a mistake in the same direction, or they're all intentionally conspiring to some secret nefarious intent. And so that's why with climate change, there are a whole range of conspiracy theories, from climate scientists faking the data to exaggerate it, even though the data is produced by multiple teams from countries all over the world, all finding the same result. To ClimateGate was an example in 2009, probably the biggest proliferation of conspiracy theories, where climate scientists' emails were hacked and posted on the internet. And then people started trawling through all of these emails and just picking out quotes, quote mining all this private correspondence and painting them in the worst possible light to to convey the impression that the scientists were conspiring. Now, since those emails were stolen, there have been 9 separate investigations from a whole range of different bodies, universities, government, in different countries. And all of them have found that the scientists had never done anything wrong. They were just doing science and arguing amongst themselves the way scientists do. But each time that a new investigation came out clearing the scientists, the response from the conspiracy theorists was, well, the investigators must be part of the conspiracy as well. And that's one of the challenges with conspiracy theorists. Any new evidence against the conspiracy is just integrated into that conspiracy, and the conspiracy grows larger. So there is really little or no evidence that can change the mind of someone who thinks that all the scientific evidence is a result of the conspiracy. So if we go to the next slide, right, this is what I thought was coming up about 5 slides earlier. Now, a practical way to implement this approach of misconception-based learning is MOOCs. Now, does anyone here aware of what MOOCs are? Not that many, okay. So MOOCs are massive open online courses. They're massive in that any number of students can enrol. Our MOOC has had about 18,000 students enrol in it so far. They're open in that anyone, they're open in that they're free for anyone to enrol in. They're online, which means that people can view them on the web, on their phone, on their iPad. There's an iPhone app that allows people to watch all the lectures in our MOOC. And so MOOCs are just a powerful way to get education out to a broad audience, being free and open to anyone. So we've had 18,000 students from 166 countries. And so it's also a way to scale up education that would normally reach a room full of students and scale it up to tens or even hundreds of thousands. Some of the biggest MOOCs have had 200 or more, 200,000 students. I think I enrolled in a social psychology MOOC that had 290,000 students, which was incredible. And at the end of the MOOC, they had an assignment where the top graded assignment, that student was flown to the university and they got to meet the Dalai Lama. So it's a fairly, not many MOOCs offered students to get to meet the Dalai Lama. So I guess 290,000 is probably an outlier, but yeah, typically MOOCs get thousands or tens of thousands of students. Now, what we did with ours was about climate change, about climate science, but it wasn't just about explaining the climate science. It was also explaining how people think about climate science. So it was a mix of the physical science and social science. So we looked at the psychology of denial, what are the major drivers of people who deny the science. And then at the end, we looked at the psychology of debunking and misinformation, which is basically everything that I've talked about today. And then in the middle, we explained climate science. We explained how global warming is happening, how humans are causing it, and the impacts of climate change. With each lecture, we also debunked a specific myth. So we explain the facts, we use that structure of the fact, the myth, the fallacy, and we basically inoculated the students against 50 different climate myths, the most common myths, and explaining the techniques. So we're going through those 5 techniques of denial and reinforcing the techniques all the way through. So what we did was we taught the science of climate change, and we also inoculated them against the misinformation that distorts that science. And then lastly, we gave them the psychological research on how to respond to science denial, how to respond to misinformation themselves. And so, I think that's all I've got to say, actually. I'm happy to answer any questions. But I guess in summary, science denial is something that we can't ignore. It does interfere with learning. It interferes with public understanding of climate change, and therefore it interferes with public support of climate action. And so it is something that scientists do have to look at and address. And a growing body of evidence tells us that inoculating people against the techniques of denial is an effective way of doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Now we're going to start with the Q&A section. Si tienen preguntas, recuerden que si no pueden hacer la pregunta en inglés, la pregunta la hacen en español y se le traduce a John para que les pueda contestar. Entonces, ¿podemos comenzar? ¿Preguntas? Bueno, en lo que se les quita la pena, yo puedo hacer una pregunta. ¿Ya tiene una? Adelante.
John, there is another theory, I mean, this has been developing for at least 50 years that I am aware of, and it's the name of this new branch of knowledge, let's call it that way, is agnotology, which is the use of not knowing to falsify things and direct people in a certain direction. What's your opinion on that?
One of the first, I guess, steps for me in coming into this was I was at the AGU fall meeting in San Francisco, and at a dinner I sat next to Daniel Bedford, who's a professor at Weber State University in Utah, and Daniel Bedford uses the technique of agnotology-based learning in his classroom. And so agnotology is the study of ignorance, as in how do misunderstandings originate. And so what Daniel does is he teaches the students where do misconceptions come from. It's basically what I was talking about. So yeah, I started by looking at agnotology-based learning, and it resonated with what I was learning about the psychology of debunking. So I was looking at these two strands of research, psychology research and educational research, both seeming to converge. And then down the track, that's when I came upon inoculation theory, which was a third strand of research, again converging on this same approach. So yeah, I think that there's quite a robust approach. It's a bit like human-caused global warming, many lines of evidence converging on a single approach. Yeah. And by the way, Dan Bedford is one of the lecturers in our course too. I asked him because we've been corresponding ever since that time about his work. We wrote a paper together about agnotology-based learning. And then when we were developing this course, I asked him if he wanted to do a lecture in our course. He said no, he was too busy. And I said, okay, no, you are doing a lecture, because we've got to have the guy who invented agnotology-based learning to do a lecture in a course that uses the approach of agnotology-based learning.
Okay, thank you. First of all, John, thank you very much for this very interesting conference. I have a question that is related. I'm thinking about the simple scheme of communication is the source, the message, and the recipient. You talked a lot about how to get the message across, and you talked a little bit about the recipients. I want to ask you a question with respect to the source, basically the scientific community. In particular, I think there is some mistrust in general about authorities and about experts, and I think more in particular also about environmental scientists, because they are telling us many things that we don't like or that the general audience don't like. So I wonder if you have also information about the extent to which this general lack of distrust of authorities, of experts, is affecting the whole process of climate change communication.
Yeah, trust in scientists is a huge piece of the puzzle. And in fact, my PhD research began by looking at that issue. And what I found was one of my earliest experiments was presenting consensus information to people. And what I found with American participants was that overall there was an increase in perceived consensus and climate belief when people were told there was a consensus. But at the conservative end of the scale, they actually decreased their climate belief. So in other words, if I told people there's 97% consensus among climate scientists, strong conservative says, well, I believe it less than ever now. And so what my experiments did was enable me to look a bit under the hood, what was going on here. Because I measured a whole range of different measures in my survey, and one of them was trust in scientists. I found that as you go from liberal to conservative, trust in scientists went from high to low. So conservatives had a lower trust in scientists. Then when I presented consensus information, that line got even steeper. It activated distrust amongst the conservatives. But it only happened at a small number of participants at the far end, at the extreme end of the political scale. And so in one way, this led me in a very meandering way towards inoculation theory, because I thought if distrust of scientists causes good information to backfire, could inoculation and distrust of misinformation, could that cause misinformation to backfire? And so that's one aspect of it. But I think another consequence of this result is that the source matters, as you say. Scientists are not trusted by strong conservatives. And so that means that for scientists themselves, the audience that they probably should be targeting is not the people who are strongly opposed and distrustful of their messages, but the large undecided majority who are open to scientific evidence. On the other hand, it also means that sources of information who are trusted by these conservatives are potentially effective. And there's research indicating that when people who share the values of their audience communicate the science, then that's much more receptive than if it's a scientist who is perceived to not share their values. And ultimately, values is a big player here, and trust and values are all interacting. Humans are tribal in nature, and so when we perceive that someone's in our tribe sharing our values, we're much more receptive to their information, and we're also much less receptive and distrustful of people who we perceive to not share our values. So I guess a practical application of this is finding conservatives who to communicate climate change to conservative audiences. One example is Catherine Hayhoe, who is an evangelical Christian who talks to conservative Christian audiences in Texas. In the region she lives in, she says that 90% of the population don't believe in climate change. It's an extraordinarily high percentage. And so she's she won't be out of a job for the rest of her life, I think, going out and talking to communities about climate change.
Sí, buenos días, John. Sí, tenía un par de cuestiones. La primera es el premio Nobel Paul Krugman hablaba de que entre los movimientos negacionistas existía un contenido anti-intelectualista o anti-científico. Quería preguntarte si tú compartes este diagnóstico de este supuesto anti-intelectualismo. Y en segundo lugar, he notado que entre los académicos utilizan, digamos, diversas categorías para referirse a este discurso, a este movimiento. Por ejemplo, se habla de negacionismo, otros hablan de escépticos, otros de opositores y de contrarios. En fin, hay una gama, digamos, de categorías y de términos. El investigador Ray Dunlap utiliza negacionismo y escepticismo, por ejemplo, ¿no? De manera distinta. Entonces quería preguntarte, dentro de lo que he escuchado, parece que tú prefieres usar negacionismo, pero en todo caso, preguntarte acerca de de esta terminología diversa que se registra dentro de los propios académicos para referirse a este discurso.
Thanks for those questions. The first question was quoting Paul Krugman, who talks about this growing anti-intellectualism and I guess this sort of anti-science sentiment amongst, I guess, conservatives or amongst at least climate science denial. And yeah, there is that I guess this anti-intellectual I guess themes in the components of climate action and climate science denial. One study has done by Stefan Undowski, who's my PhD supervisor. He's run surveys where he measures all different acceptance of different types of science, whether it's climate or GMO or evolution or vaccination, and he finds that denial in one branch of science has a flow-on effect to other areas of science as well. So there is that element to, I guess, of spillage, where distrust of climate science is spilling over into other areas of science as well, which is quite a disturbing thing. It possibly happens at a psychological level, but I think it's also happened at a political level, because one of the kind of, I guess it's a mind-blowing developments over the last 20 years is the conservative think tanks that I talked about earlier in my talk. They started, like, the whole driving philosophy of conservative think tanks is preserving the free market, preventing government regulation of free markets and industry. And like we're all familiar with that in the case of fossil fuel industries. But what we've seen is an alliance with attacking the fossil fuel and climate science, but also attacking the tobacco science. The tobacco industry actually have funded conservative think tanks to attack tobacco science, but also they in their packages they also attack climate science and a whole range of other environmental sciences. So at a practical level, these conservative think tanks have been attacking a whole range of sciences, and climate science was one of the innocent bystanders of this tobacco attack on science, which is unfortunate. So yeah, I guess that's the addressing the question about anti-intellectualism, I hope. Your second question was terms used to describe people who deny climate science. And this has been an ongoing debate for years. Do we use the term skeptics or deniers? Associated Press just issued a press release over the last month saying that we shouldn't use the word skeptics, but we shouldn't use the word deniers either, so we should call them doubters, or people who reject mainstream climate science. Now, you commented that I seem to favour the term denial. Now, the reason why I do that is because there's a whole body of scientific research into the phenomenon of denial, and we can't understand it. We can't understand the psychology of what's driving denial and the techniques of denial without drawing upon this scientific research. And so I think it's crucial that we accurately identify and understand this phenomenon, because it has severe societal consequences. So the term skeptic is a completely inappropriate term to use to describe people who are rejecting climate science, because skepticism is what scientists do. Scientists look at the body of evidence first, and then skeptically, and then come to a conclusion. What people who deny the science do is they have their conclusion already decided, usually driven by issues like culture or ideology, and then they deny any scientific evidence that conflicts with their predetermined position. So skepticism and denial are two polar opposites. They couldn't be further apart. And so climate denial is actually giving the good name of skepticism a bad name. It's taken the whole shine of what we should be promoting, good skeptic thought amongst the community. That's why I called my website Skeptical Science. I'm trying to take back the word skepticism for how it's meant to be practiced, and an evidence-based approach to understanding how our world works. Another term I think which is useful is the Six Americas use the term dismissives for the group who dismiss climate science, and I think that's a good word because it doesn't have some of the emotive connotations of the word denier. And I tried using it, but it just didn't take on. It didn't catch on. So I tend to use the word denial. But again, I try to use it as a verb rather than as a noun or a term. I try to talk about the process of denial rather than labeling people as deniers, because it's really the psychological process of denial which is what we need to understand.
Thank you for your presentation. I have not exactly a question, but a comment, and I would like you to comment on my comment. And I was wondering, you have this line facts, communication, and recipients, and we're focusing on communication, how to improve the communication. But I was wondering, isn't that the context missing? Where's the context of this communication is happening? Because we can think of climate change being of concern, for instance, if you go to the Pacific Islands, and of course the inhabitants of these small islands, they will be all concerned. So there's not reason to talk about denial there. We talk about denial, or you talk about denial in a context, American context, very much, and this is of course understandable. But in the case of the Pacific Island people, we talk about vulnerabilities, and they of course are more exposed, so they will be more aware of climate change. But should we start talking about other kind of vulnerabilities as well? Because, for instance, the people that are in a very well-off status might be feeling, to some level, the vulnerability, or feel vulnerable, that they will, if they admit it, then they will have to give up in their comforts. So there is a question of, but they are vulnerable too, in a way. I mean, if you have a level of comfort that is very good, and it applies to most of us, then of course we are accepted and we are ready to change our lives, right? Everybody. But Americans, or rest of all Americans, that have a higher status and university cars, wouldn't they feel vulnerable as well if they accept it? And does that play a role? And the last small thing I want to say is that you make the comparison with the tobacco industry that has kind of an individual, refers to an individual responsibility. If I smoke, I get cancer, it's my decision, I might want to kill myself. But in the case of climate change, isn't another issue. It's what I do that affects others. It's with my actions in the community that the community gets affected. So even the language, we don't have that. We don't have that in the research, and we don't have that as a way of communicating climate as well. I just wondered what comments you have to that.
Yeah, those are great comments. And I guess I should clarify that everything I'm talking about is just one really small piece of the puzzle. And I guess when I started out working here, I identified, realizing that we can't do everything. Picking that one thing that I thought, one lever where you could make a significant difference, and focusing on that. And I saw that misinformation, and in particular perceived consensus, was a powerful lever. But in our course, we have one lecture called The Dragons of Inaction. And I'm drawing on the work of Bob Gifford, who's a psychology researcher from Canada. And he identifies, I think there's about 31 different, what he calls dragons of inaction, or psychological barriers to people acting on climate change. And misinformation and literal denial of the sort I'm talking about is just one of those dragons amongst many. And what Bob reflects on is the fact that the human brain has evolved to our history has got to a point where our brain is completely ill-equipped to deal with an issue like climate change, which is global and decadal and over big regions and caused by everyone. And so there's all these psychological challenges, and there's also other dragons of inaction or barriers are the fact that people who are well off are less concerned about climate change because they feel insulated from the impacts. They feel like they can afford to adapt to it. And so that's one amongst many different barriers. And I'm not diminishing those other factors. There's lots of different challenges for communicators in addressing all these issues. Psychological distance is another. The fact that we perceive that climate change is happening to different places or in different times or to in a way that seems distant to us. And so as communicators we need to find ways to overcome all those different psychological barriers. Even if we could deal with the denial and the misinformation, even if that didn't exist, we would still have all these other barriers to contend with as well. That's a bit of a depressing thought. Maybe we could finish up with more encouraging thought. I know we're out of time.
Thank you, John. I would have just one small question. The Ipcc not only creates knowledge, but also communicates the science. So sometimes the Ipcc is called a panic monger, and sometimes they say they're acting too conservative about their results. What would be your recommendation for the Ipcc science communication?
The Ipcc, two things. A paper.
Sorry. Desconecta conecta el Politécnico porque tienen a Jorge Chevers en vivo y tenemos un programa que cumplir. Esto no lo puede contestar aquí en corto, sin audio en vivo.
Okay.